I want to welcome you once again to the Upper Room and a very special happy Easter, happy Resurrection Sunday lesson. And we've been building up to this, and we'll get into a little bit of where we've been, but where we're going today is so important. And you can see our setting is one of our typical settings for Resurrection Sunday. It'll come into play quite a bit later in the lesson, so we'll leave it there for now. I want to give you a quote from a book that I am sure you probably have not read, no reason to have read it. And it's an interesting quote, but it'll get us into a story I want to begin with today. And here is the quote. This happened on December 30th, 2003. That may seem a while ago, but it won't when it happens to you. Kind of a strange quote, isn't it? Well, it comes from a book written by a lady by the name of Joan Didion. And she wrote this book in 2007, so she's looking back on something that happened in her life 4 years prior. And the name of the book, interesting name, is The Year of Magical Thinking. Now, what was this about? Let me give you the backstory. What is really the reason for the writing of the book? She and her husband lived in the San Francisco area, and they had gone to visit their daughter who was in a coma in the hospital. And so their focus was on their daughter and whether she would live or not. And in fact, she would pass away a year from that point. But that's not really what this story is about. They returned home and sat down for dinner. She put dinner on the table and he sat down. And as they began just another dinner together, her husband, a guy by the name of John Donne, who was also an author, and these are very bright people, had a massive coronary attack and died right there at the table. It is as a result of what happened there that she wrote her book. Now, there's no need for you to read her book, but the point of the book was basically her expressing the fact that she and all of her friends were articulate and bright and wealthy and powerful, and they had lived lives for the purpose and with the idea in mind of having total control over their lives, and that they could determine and dictate what their lives would be like until this moment. That's what she's referring to in that quote. Until this day in 2003 when all of that went out the window. Interestingly, she goes into the fact that for a long time after his passing, she did a lot of things thinking she could bring him back. She would say that realistically she knew she couldn't, but for a while she kind of thought if she did the right things, if she figured out how he died, and if she didn't give his clothes away and other things like that, talk about him as though he was still alive to her friends, that he may come back. He may come back from the dead, I guess, is what she was hoping. She would sleep alone in that bed thinking one of these nights he will reappear in my bed next to me and I can still be in control. Kind of the thesis of her book was that death will not have the final say in this. I can control life enough that I can maybe even control what happens in death. Well, the last thing she wrote in her book was significant, and I want to read it to you. It's just a phrase that is, in her mind, how she feels about what Jesus said. And after many months, she wrote this phrase that was the last thing she wrote in her book. And the phrase is this: "No eye is on the sparrow." Yeah, that's definitely a shot at Jesus, who says that my Father knows even when one sparrow falls to the ground, and he cares. It was her way of saying there is no God, and if there is a God, he doesn't care. And that really became the theme of her life, because things got out of her control. Well, that's appropriate for Resurrection Sunday, because resurrection, the whole idea of it, is that God has made a way for there to be life after this life. And yet she didn't seem to have any reason to believe that. You know, we all want to be immortal, and even comedians joke about it. I mentioned Stephen Wright before, one of my favorite comedians. And he once simply said, I intend to live forever. So far, so good. But we want control, don't we? We want to believe that we have a say in all this. And yet what we've learned about the resurrection is that it gives us hope, but it was that very hope that Joan Didion could not find and eventually gave up on ever finding. We have a hope that we could be immortal. And resurrection, the idea of resurrection, the resurrection of Jesus certainly makes that possible. And that's why we've been in this mini-series, 3 weeks of it now, and our final installment is today, Resurrection Sunday. And we have covered the details of resurrection. We've covered the destiny, how our destiny does change based on the idea of resurrection, which is only possible because of the resurrection of Jesus. And today there's this idea of determination. In other words, we're asking the question today, what would living a resurrection life look like? We know about our destiny, we know about the details of Jesus' resurrection, but what if we were to live lives based on the idea of resurrection lives, what might that look like? Now, before we get into that, however, there are some details about the resurrection that, although we covered quite a few, intrinsic and extrinsic, there are some details that I want to touch on that we have not yet spoken about. And I want to do that quickly, and then we'll get into what does a resurrection life actually look like. So this part of the review, before we go on, I want to call Back to the Future. We're going to go way back and way forward in what we read in the way back time. And so we go to Pentecost. And as we've said in earlier lessons, timeline is really important. So let's get the timeline. Pentecost is about 6 weeks, 50 days after Passover. Therefore, we know that Jesus was crucified during the Passover, and then the day after the Passover, he rose from the dead. So we're talking roughly 6 weeks later. That's important, because in a period of 6 weeks in Jerusalem, there had now been enough time, plenty of time, for people to really go and find out if this supposed resurrection of this supposed Messiah was actually true. And a lot of people were still in Jerusalem. Thousands of foreigners from other countries, sojourners who were Jewish, had come, and they, I'm sure, had heard about all this. And there was quite the ruckus. Remember when he did die on the cross, the temple again really shook and the curtain was torn from top to bottom. Certainly everybody in Jerusalem knew something had happened. And so in 6 weeks, they had plenty of time to investigate. Did that really happen? Did some supposed Messiah die on the cross, a Roman cross? And did he actually rise from the dead? And so we find ourselves at Pentecost, and people are there from all other nations, and all of a sudden a rushing wind comes in, and we know, looking back, the Holy Spirit has come upon them. And tongues of fire settled on the heads, or over the heads, of the apostles who were there that day. And so thousands of people have gathered, and it's getting crazy, and people are accusing people of being drunk at like 9 or 10 in the morning because they're speaking in their native tongues. There are all kinds of languages being spoken, and they are known languages. It's not babbling. And so Peter, empowered by the Spirit of God, takes advantage of this incredible opportunity to stand up and begin to preach the very first gospel message. And he does so. We're going to pick it up when he begins to talk. And it's what he says that's really fascinating. Here we go. We pick it up in Acts chapter 2, verse 23. Peter says, "People of Israel, listen. God publicly endorsed Jesus the Nazarene by doing powerful miracles, wonders, and signs through him, as you well know. But God knew what would happen, and his prearranged plan was carried out when Jesus was betrayed. With the help of lawless Gentiles, you nailed him to a cross and killed him." There's a lot in there, right? The prearranged plan. There was a prearranged plan. This did not happen by accident, Peter says. This was prophesied. It was predicted that it would happen. And oh, by the way, You teamed up with the godless Gentiles and you put him on the cross. This has to be the Spirit of God emboldening him, because he's a different guy than he was just 6 weeks earlier. He goes on. But God released him from the horrors of death and raised him back to life. There it is. He makes a statement that at that very moment, hundreds, if not thousands, could have revolted and said, no, we've been to the tomb. His body is still there. But they didn't. They just sat in rapt attention because they knew it was true. Now going on in verse 24, he raised him back to life, for death could not keep him in its grip. That death that we're all so fearful of, and it seems so powerful, could not keep Jesus in its grip, he says. And now he does something fascinating. He is going to quote King David from Psalm chapter 16, verses 8 through 11. Here we go, and it's important that he does this. He goes on. King David said, I see that the Lord is always with me. I will not be shaken, for he is right beside me. What's that about? There are a few times in prophetic scripture, like Psalm 22, where all of a sudden David, as the writer, goes from writing about God to in fact writing as though Jesus is speaking through him, and it goes into the first person in prophetic language, and that's what's happening. Jesus is speaking through him now. That's really important. Again, he says, I see that the Lord is always with me. I will not be shaken, for he is right beside me. Why is that important for people to know? Because what's about to happen. Verse 26, no wonder my heart is glad and my tongue shouts his praise. My body rests in hope. What's that about? The Messiah is looking forward 1,000 years and saying there'll be a time when you will think my body is distressed, but my body rests in hope. He's in the grave. I am assured that my Father has not left me, is what he's saying. Verse 28, you have shown me the way of life. He's talking to the Father now. While I'm in the grave, you will have shown me the way of life, and you will fill me with joy of your presence. He will stop quoting David from Psalm 16 and come back to the present, and he will kind of be understanding that people are confused about that. So explain what has happened, that he's not talking about David, and David speaking of himself. We pick it up in verse 29. Dear brothers, think about this. You can be sure that the patriarch David wasn't referring to himself, for he died and was buried, and his tomb is still here among us. And that was true. They knew where the tomb of David was in Jerusalem. But he was a prophet, and he knew God had promised with an oath that one of David's own descendants would sit on his throne. That would be Jesus, that would come and sit on the throne. David was looking into the future and speaking of the Messiah's resurrection. This was prophetic, Peter says, of the Messiah's resurrection, being raised from the dead. He was saying that God would not leave him among the dead or allow his body to rot in the grave. Verse 32, Peter ends this way. God raised Jesus from the dead, and we are all witnesses of this. That's really important. Thousands of people that went, So this idea that it was a legend made up 100 years later, not a chance, Lance. Now let's fast forward to Paul, and Paul is preaching in Antioch in the synagogue. Okay, so now on the timeline, we're not 6 weeks out from the resurrection, but now it's about 48 AD. So we're probably about 15 to 18 years out from it. And the question becomes, is the message here consistent? Let's pick it up in Acts 13, verse 29. When they had done all that the prophets said about him, they took him down from the cross and placed him in a tomb. He's saying it was prophesied he would die, the Messiah would die on the cross. They put him in a tomb. Verse 30, but God raised him from the dead. It's the same message. It's still the core message. God raised him from the dead, and over a period of many days, he appeared to those who had gone with him from Galilee to Jerusalem. They are now his witnesses to the people of Israel. We know that there were over 500 of them, and Paul is still speaking of them And as he said in 1 Corinthians 15, you can go speak to them. They're still alive, many of them. Some have fallen asleep, some have died, but you can go talk to them. The message is consistent, even 15 years later. Now Paul continues in verse 32, and now we are here to bring you the good news. The promise was made to our ancestors, and God has now fulfilled it for us, their descendants, by raising Jesus. This is what the second psalm says about Jesus. Now he's going back to Psalm 2. You are my son, today I have become your father. For God had promised to raise him from the dead, not leaving him to rot in the grave. He said, I will give you the sacred blessings I promised to David. That's in Isaiah 55. And now back to Psalm 16. He quotes Psalm 16 as Peter had on Pentecost. Another psalm explains it more fully. You will not allow your Holy One to rot in the grave. Okay, so Paul has clearly tied his good news message to what Peter said. Peter had tied it clear back to 1,000 years earlier to what David had said. Let's go a little bit further into Paul's life now. In Acts chapter 26, the timeline is probably 62 AD. We're talking 30 years now. So we looked at 6 weeks past the resurrection. Then we looked at 15 years past the resurrection. Now we look basically at 30 years past the resurrection. Has the message stayed the same? And now Paul is before King Agrippa and telling his testimony. And we pick up in Acts chapter 26, verse 22. But God has protected me right up to this present time, so I can testify to everyone, from the least to the greatest. And Paul goes on, I teach nothing except what the prophets and Moses said would happen, that the Messiah would suffer and be the first to rise from the dead, and in this way announce God's light to Jews and Gentiles alike. And as you know, Agrippa says, you're crazy. You're a crazy man. Because Agrippa hadn't been there in Jerusalem. And he says, this sounds outlandish to me. But the point being that even Paul, many years later, said this was prophesied. This idea that this would happen with the Messiah, this is a detail that you need to pay attention to. They said he would rise from the dead. His Father would raise him from the dead. Now let's go back to the book of John, early in the Gospel of John, and Jesus says this, John 2:19. All right, Jesus replied, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. What? They exclaimed. It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you can rebuild it in 3 days? They can only think in one way, right? In what they see and touch and experience. But when Jesus said his temple, John says now, later, writing about that moment, he meant his own body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered he had said this, and they believed both the scriptures and what Jesus had said. Prophecy fulfilled. The scriptures and what Jesus said. The scriptures to them were the prophets. They had predicted it. Then he again agreed. Jesus himself said, yeah, the prophets were right, and it'll be me, and I will raise from the dead. Okay, all that to say, that's a detail we didn't touch on. It's an important one, because now we have the evidence that 1,000 years earlier, it was prophesied that this would happen, and it fulfilled that prophecy, and it was God's plan all along. Nobody stepped on Jesus like a rose. It wasn't that he was a victim. This was prepared way before, and it happened just as the Father had wanted it to happen. So why all this focus on the details? Well, these prophecies are essential because it shows that the resurrection is not just a facet of our faith. It is the foundation of our faith. As Paul would write in 1 Corinthians 15, we studied it in the first lesson of this mini-series. That is, if he did not rise from the dead, we have nothing to talk about. It's all foolishness and we're lying. And you have no faith. It's all about the resurrection. And that's why this day, Resurrection Sunday, is the greatest day of the year, without a doubt. It's important that you remember that. And it's important that we not allow the outright lies of Satan, like, oh, this was a legend that was made up 100 years later, and the subtle lies, like, oh, this is about bunnies and eggs and things like that. You not allow that to creep into the truth of what this day is all about. So, That was all review. Here we go. We come to the so what of this whole mini-series. And the so what is found in 1 Corinthians 15, if you'll turn there again. And we covered a lot of ground. Now we go clear to verses 54 through 58, and this is where we'll land. And again, the question is, okay, so we know what our destiny is. We've covered the details. So how do we live a resurrection life? Let's begin in verse 54 of 1 Corinthians 15. When the perishable has been clothed with imperishable, and the mortal with immortality, that's our future, that's our destiny. We've talked about the details of the resurrection, the destiny. Now we come to the determination of the resurrection. That is, how shall we then live based on those ideas being true? Then the saying that is written will come true. Death has been swallowed up in victory. That's the here and now. Death is no longer something we fear, something that we run from, something that we don't want to talk about or think about. It's interesting that where we're filming, we were going to actually film several hours earlier. We came to film here, and literally 15 feet from here, they were lowering a body into the ground. So we needed to delay this film. Let them do what was really important in their family's life. But the point is, I guarantee you, gathered here were some people who really fear death and are so concerned about what that means for them. But Paul says the what now is we no longer live in fear. He goes on in verse 55. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? Nothing more to fear, no pain to live with anymore. The sting of death is sin, and the power of the sin is in the law. But thanks be to God, he gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. So what does that victory look like? It's not just a someday, and it's not, oh, in the past, let me tell you what happened. It's now. We live, the resurrection life is a life of victory. We live victorious lives. We conquer. That's the kind of life he's called us to. But what does it look like? One of my favorite stories, I know I've shared before, but I got to share it again, is that a dad came home from working a 10, 12-hour day, and he put his briefcase down, and he hugged his kids, and then he they said, can you play with us, Dad? And he says, well, we're going to eat dinner together, and then I've brought my briefcase home. I've got some more work to do. At that point, his little boy looked up at him and said, Dad, can't they put you in a slower group? So, can't you keep up? Why do you have to bring your work home? Which is a great question. Believe it or not, the resurrection life has to do with work. It really does. And we'll get to that now in verse 58, the last verse of this chapter of resurrection. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. So that is the verse we will now unpack together. So there are three things about this resurrection life I want you to notice. The first is simply this. The resurrection life is a life where an individual has decided that the resurrection is enough to live a radical life for the resurrected one. Did you get that? It is where we have decided, if we're going to live a resurrection life, that the resurrection of itself is reason enough to live a radical life. All you have to do is look back to the disciples. From the moment of the resurrection forward, they lived radical lives. They didn't live like everybody else any longer. And for 2,000 years, that's been the case. People who follow Jesus, not because of his life necessarily, or his death, but it's his resurrection, which gave meaning to his life and his death, have lived radical lives. Radical is really the best word to describe how people have lived over the last 2,000 years. Although today I wouldn't call what I see radical the lives of most people who call themselves Christians. We do our best to fit in and be normal. Not so with the original disciples. And we've seen that in how they all died. Back in John chapter 7, verse 38, Jesus called this life a life where living water flows from them. Living water flows from these people who believe that the resurrection itself of Jesus is enough to live a radical life. It's living water, as Jesus called it, that flows from us. Let me take you to Romans 8, verse 15. I'll read it from the Message. And it reads this way: this resurrection life you receive from God is not a timid, grave-tending life. It's not just a maintenance thing where we put flowers out and mow the grass around the grave. It's not a grave-tending life. It's adventurously expectant, greeting God with a childlike, "What's next, Papa?" I love it when my grandkids say it to me. "What are we going to do now, Papa?" That's the life. God's Spirit touches our spirits and confirms who we really are. That's one reason we're here, is because honestly, selfishly, I would love for Jesus to come back during my lifetime. And should he come back during my lifetime, if that happens, you know where I want to be? Here. I want to be here. I want to be right here. I want to see the dead in Christ come out of the ground. And that means somebody right behind me that we're going to talk about in a little bit. Wouldn't that be fun, though? That's a "what's next, Papa?" attitude. Now, a big part of living this resurrection life, this anticipation mindset of what is the Father going to do next, has to do with making sure that we understand how the Father keeps score in life. Because if we're honest, a lot of this life is about keeping score, isn't it? That's how we live life. Who's ahead? Who's behind? That kind of thing. Let me go back to a parable Jesus taught quickly in Luke 12:16. Then he told him this story. A rich man had a fertile farm that produced fine crops. He said to himself, "What should I do? I don't have room for all my crops." Then he said, "I know. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. Then I'll have room enough to store all my wheat and other goods. And then I'll sit back and say to myself, 'Oh, my friend, you have enough stored away for years to come. Now take it easy, eat, drink, and be merry.'" That's how you keep score in this world. You keep score by saying, "I need to accumulate enough that life is really easy and nothing but fun. And I will control life that way." Remember how we started with Mrs. Didion wanting to control her life? Eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, from the lips of Jesus, "You fool. You will die this very night. Then who will get everything you worked for?" And then Jesus concludes the story this way: "Yes, a person is a fool to store up earthly wealth, but not have a rich relationship with God." Your translation may say, "be rich toward God." That is, the score is about where you stand with God. It's not about how much you accumulate, how you can now do whatever you want. We now start to understand how God keeps score. This is how he keeps score in the resurrection life. It is about where we stand with him, in our relationship with him, and how much we trust him, and how confident we are in him, that he is our everything. When I was in college in Joplin, Missouri, I needed some extra money, so I got a job at what everybody said was the coolest place in all of Joplin. It was a restaurant called the Gazebo, and people told me that it's owned by strong Christians, and so you'll love working for them. I may have mentioned this before, but it's kind of a funny story. I worked one night. They had said I would be finished by 9 o'clock. Well, that first night, as a dishwasher in the Gazebo, I was working and 9 o'clock came, and I turned to the guy I was working with and said, "So we're done." He goes, "Oh, we're not done. Look at all these dishes." I said, "But they said we'd be done by 9, and I need to be done by 9. I have homework to do, and I need to get up at 5:30 in the morning." He said, "We're not done till they tell us we're done." We didn't leave that place until 10:30 that night. And I said, "Is this typical?" He goes, "Yeah, this is the way it is." And I realized that night, as I stayed up till probably 12:30 in the morning studying, that wasn't going to work. It just wasn't going to work. But I had been reassured. These guys are Christian guys that own this. So the next day I went back and I saw them sitting at a table, doing some paperwork and talking. And so I went over and introduced myself and said, "I began working for you last night." And they said, "Yeah." I said, I can't do it. I thought that the job on the nights I would work would end at 9, but it's not. It's going to be 10:30, 11 like last night. And these guys kept score differently than I thought they did. They got angry. I thought that followers of Jesus would go, "Well, that's okay. If it doesn't work for you, God provides, and, do what you feel the Lord wants you to do." That's not what they did. They got angry with me. "How dare you? How dare you take a job and then back out after a day?" I mean, they read me the riot act. They ripped me a new one. And it was then that I realized that sometimes Christians, even people who have quite the reputation for being Christians, still keep score the way the culture keeps score. Not necessarily the way God keeps score. Because I fully expected them to be understanding of my plight, but not so much. John Ortberg, the author, puts it this way: we live in Ladderville. You know what he means by that? We live in a culture where it's about climbing the ladder. Choose the ladder you want to climb, but we're climbing ladders. Whether it's prosperity or position or wealth, whatever you want to call it, we have ladders we climb. And interestingly, as we climb these ladders, guess what? Jesus is climbing down the ladder. That's what he did. Philippians 2 describes how he came down the ladder. He descended on earth. He gave up all that prestige. And we pass him as we climb the ladders of this culture. You see, it's important, if we're going to live resurrection lives, that we learn to keep score as God keeps score. And that is, my relationship with him, our relationship with him and one another, is priority number one. There's no ladder climbing for us. It's about understanding and living within the resurrected life he's asked us to live. You may know someone in your life, I do, who eats dinner, but dinner is just a means to an end. The end is dessert. That's what it's all about. And you just do whatever dinner you need to get to the dessert. I think we grow up that way as kids, actually, and some of us do that our whole lives. Dinner is a means to an end. Some of us say that the resurrected life is just a means to an end. That is, I got to get to heaven, so I got to do what I got to do. No, the resurrected life and the resurrection of Jesus is not a means to an end. It's not heaven we're aiming for. It is living with Jesus here and now, and yes, forever. That's the end. Living the resurrected life is the end game, now. And that's the decision we make if we choose to live a resurrection life. So first of all, resurrection life is about a decision. And the second component of it is diligently living for the resurrected one. All right? Being diligent in the life we choose to live. The word diligent comes from the Latin, and it literally means love and take delight in. We are to love and take delight in the opportunity to live for the resurrected one. That's the resurrection life. Remember, I said that another way to put this, a very simple way to put it, is work. Did you know that the word work shows up 174 times in the New Testament, and many of those times are from the lips of Jesus? Let me give you a couple examples of that. John 5:36, Jesus says, I have a greater witness than John, my teachings and my miracles. The Father gave me these works to accomplish, and they prove that he sent me. John 14, verse 8. Philip said, Lord, show us the Father, and we'll be satisfied. Jesus replied, have I been with you all this time, Philip, and you still don't know who I am? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. So why are you still asking me to show him to you? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words I speak are not my own, but my Father who lives in me and does the work, does his work through me. Just believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or at least believe because of the work you have seen me do. Verse 12, I tell you the truth, anyone who believes in me will do the same works I have done, and even greater works, because I am going to be with the Father. Now remember, grace, because I can hear you thinking, grace is opposed to work. No, grace is opposed to earning. It's not opposed to effort. And that's what I'm saying. Be diligent in how we live this resurrected life, and it will take effort. It's not something we just sit back and coast until we get to our goal, heaven. It is about work. 1 Corinthians 15:58, again, we just read it. Now listen to it with that context in mind. Therefore, because of all that I've said about resurrection, how important it is in detail and destiny, because of all that, Paul says, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm, let nothing move you. Always be giving yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. 4 imperatives in that short verse. Here they are. Stand firm. stand firm. It literally means have a seat. Settle it right now that this is what you will do. The second imperative is let nothing move you. Don't drift. Settle it now. Settle in with this resurrection life. And now, no drifting here. We're not going to drift in and out of it. We're going to stay settled right there. Imperative number 3, always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord. The word fully means to exceed the requirements, to overflow, to overdo it. What if you actually overdid it? What if you said, I'm just so exhausted from working with the Lord and for Him. I've overdone it. And that's what I'm supposed to do. The fourth imperative is your labor in the Lord is not in vain. The time, the energy, the money, the talent, the gifts, the body, the mind, and the soul that you spend is not in vain. Remember, again, grace is opposed to earning. We don't earn this resurrection life. It was given to us by Jesus through His resurrection. And so grace does oppose earning, but not effort at all. Philippians 1:27, above all, Paul writes, you must be citizens of heaven. You know what's important about this is that he's writing to a church in a place called Philippi, which was a Roman colony. Romans set up this colony for its expatriates, its ex-soldiers, men of war, to go and live out their lives, the rest of their days with their families. And it was something they were proud to be, citizens of Rome. And so he now uses that same terminology because they understood the power of being a citizen of Rome. And so Paul writes, you must live as citizens of heaven. He turns the table, but it means a lot to them. Conducting yourselves in a manner worthy of the good news about Christ. The good news? The resurrection of Jesus. The good news was not the death of Jesus. A lot of people died on crosses. The good news was that on the third day, He raised from the dead. Live a life worthy of that. A resurrection life is what Paul's talking about. Therefore, our lives are to be a reflection of the power and the excellence of the resurrection of Jesus. Moving on, Romans 8:11, the Spirit of God who raised Jesus from the dead lives in you. Because you say, well, I don't know how to do that. Guess what? You really don't have to do it. You just have to let the Spirit do it in and through you. For He raised Jesus from the dead. He lives in you. And just as God raised Christ Jesus from the dead, He will give life to your mortal bodies by this same Spirit living within you. This is where this life comes from. It's not something you and I manufacture. It's not something you and I pretend. It's something that's very real because it's being done by the Spirit of God in us and through us. Philippians 1:6. Paul writes again to the church in Philippi, that Roman colony, I am certain that God who began the good work within you will continue to work until it is finally finished on the day that Christ Jesus returns. It is work. It is something we labor at. It is the priority of our lives. Philippians 2:30, for he's talking about Epaphroditus, and wants to send Epaphroditus to the church in Philippi. For he risked his life for the work of Christ, and he was at the point of death while doing for me what you couldn't do from far away. He worked himself almost to death. That's how important this resurrection life is to him. Accept him, he says. You need to get to know Epaphroditus. First and last, only discussion question. Are you ready? Took it easy on the discussion questions today. And that is this. What does your resurrection life look like? Many years ago now, I can't even tell you how many years ago, after much prayer and seeking God and listening a lot, I felt like God was calling me to live a resurrection life that was summarized, that is something I could easily remember, in 4 items. Number 1, every day, seek Him. Number 2, study Him. Number 3, serve Him. And number 4, share Him. And so that became the standard for me. Every night I think about that. Did I seek Him today? Did I do all I could do to be in touch with Jesus, to listen to him, to communicate with him. Is that what today was about, at some point at least? The second of these values, if you want to call them values, that God laid upon my heart was to study him. Did I learn from him and about him today, at some point in time? Third was to serve him. Every day, do I look back on the day and realize I served Jesus by serving other people? At what point did I serve? My family, some friends, or people I don't even know? Did I serve him today? And finally, did I share him? And usually when we think about sharing, we think about holding up a sign on the street corner down at Main and Townsend, that says, God loves you. I shared. I don't think that's what he was calling me to do. I think sharing him had to do with making disciples, because that's the last thing Jesus said before he left. Now, my final instructions are make disciples, help them mature. How do you make disciples? Well, you spend time with people and help them learn to know Jesus and live for him. That's how it's done. Why don't we do it? We've talked about this in the past. Because it's hard. It's hard. It's much easier to hold up a sign, to be honest with you. So we feel called to hold up signs. But it's hard to make disciples. It takes a long time to make disciples. And so that becomes my question every day. Did I, in some form or fashion, help someone in their journey to knowing Jesus and living for him more fully? And again, I can tell you quite honestly, there are many days when I look back over the day and went, well, I don't know that I did any of that. But hopefully and prayerfully, the resurrection life for me has included those things. And again, the disciple making thing is probably the most challenging for all of us. David Platt, in his book Radical, put it this way: disciples are not mass produced. Making disciples is not an easy process. It is trying, it is messy, it is slow, tedious, even painful at times. It is all these things because it is relational. Yeah, relationships are hard. We've talked a lot about that. Making disciples cannot be done outside of relationships. And so that became, for me, the standard as to whether I actually am living a resurrection life. Because it is what we're all called to. Now, what will you be called to? I would hope and pray that it's some form of what I just talked about. That it is multifaceted and it takes energy and effort. And yet we are to stand firm in that and not drift away from it. And we are to know finally that that labor, that work is not done in vain. And quite honestly, I'm going to be very candid with you, very forthcoming with you. This is a tough one for Christy and myself. As we look back over almost 4 decades of ministry, I can tell you that this idea comes to our mind almost daily, maybe not that often, that we wonder, is it all for naught? Has all the effort we've put in over these years, these many years, has it been in vain? And then I come back to this verse where Paul says, just trust. It's not been in vain. You may not see the evidence. You may not see the productivity. But trust that if it was done for the Lord, and it's a resurrection life you're doing, He will take care of the results. And why is that important? Because it's awful easy to live in Ladderville while living the Christian life. That's why it's important. No more climbing ladders. No more look at what I've accomplished. Trust that it's not in vain. It will be worth something to God because He makes it worth something. And third and finally, the resurrected life is a life lived where we are determined to finish well for the resurrected one. Finishing well is really, really important. The word retirement is not in the Bible. It's just not there. I know when you're climbing ladders and you're busy doing that, that's really important. But especially retiring from serving and sharing and studying and seeking Jesus, the resurrected one, we never retire from that. And unfortunately, we've known way too many people who have retired from that. They thought it was like a job. And like they retired from their job, they've retired. But a resurrection life has no retirement plan in it. As far as this world is concerned, there is a great plan, but it's not a retirement plan that awaits our new bodies. It's a new work plan is what it is. So in other words, this is what you need to hear. As long as I am breathing, I still have work to do. Jesus, the resurrected one, is not finished with me if I'm still breathing. Our dear friends, Bill and Jolene Haddock in our house church, live that out. They're still breathing, and they're still serving Jesus as much or more than they ever have. Their age, 85, I believe it is, hasn't stopped that at all. They're such great mentors in that way. And that brings us to our, not just our general location, but our specific location. Right behind me is a grave, a tombstone, if you will. And the tombstone belongs to a young lady I buried some 20 years ago. She was my first secretary when we came here 21 years ago. And for a year, she was amazing. She was a beautiful person inside and out. She loved Jesus with all her heart. She was great at what she did. She made life in our office so much fun. And then there was a day at, I think it was age 34, where she was sitting in one of our staff meetings and she said, I don't feel good. And she got up and she walked out. Well, someone followed her out, and apparently while she was out there, she had a seizure. That led to the discovery of cancer in her brain, and at the young age of 34, her husband Randy called me to her house, to their house, and she had gone to be with Jesus. Age 34. I'll tell you, that was tough, because we all want to believe we're going to live to be 85, 90, 95, whatever. But what became apparent, and Randy understood it as much as it hurt, and their daughter Rachel, as hard as it was to explain to her, her work was done. Is it possible your work could be done by age 34? Evidently, her work was done. And every time we walk in this cemetery, and I glance over and see her tombstone where her body was buried, I'm reminded that she just had 34 years of work here, and she was done, and she finished well. Is that the case for you? Whenever he calls, it's not that you and I die by accident. It's not that we leave this earth in an unplanned way and that we should fear that. It's that God knows our days. Our days are numbered by him, and we will work here. We will labor for him here until the day he says, I'm finished with you now. Now come home and experience life like you've never experienced it before. That's why we're here. I want to be here when he comes back. I'd love to see Christy rise from the dead, and all the others. I've counted some 20, 25 people I know for sure that we've laid their bodies in the grave here at this cemetery. I'd like to see them all rise from the dead on that day. Oh my goodness, what great times await us. And that's where we keep our eyes. We must finish well, and he will decide when we're finished, not us. Do you remember what we've said about Caleb? Not our son Caleb, but Caleb from the Bible. Amazing life. He was with Joshua, and the 10 other spies were sent into Canaan, to see if, could we invade this land? God's people, is it time? And 12 came back. 10 of them had a bad report. They were scared to death of the giants. And 2, Joshua and Caleb, said, no, the Lord's in charge. He'll take care of this. Let's go. Well, as you know the story, those 10 would not be allowed to ever see the promised land, and that generation was not allowed. They all died in the wilderness. But Joshua and Caleb had been given a promise by God that they would get to go back into the promised land. And 45 years later, Caleb did get to go back. Remember what God said about Caleb in Numbers 14:24? My servant Caleb has a different attitude than others have. He has remained loyal to me, so I will bring him into the land he explored. He has a different attitude. He has a different way of looking at life. And I'm going to bless him for that. And Caleb kept that attitude. A lot of us lose that attitude as we get older. We get grumpy, and we get tired of the breakdown of our bodies, and tired of this culture that's rotten to the core. We get just grumpy. Not Caleb. We pick it up in Joshua 14:10. Now, Caleb says, as you can see, he's talking to Joshua, the 2 old guys. As you can see, the Lord has kept me alive and well as he promised for all these 45 years since Moses made this promise, even while Israel wandered in the wilderness. Today I am 85 years old, like my brother Bill. I am as strong now as I was when Moses sent me on that journey, and I can still travel and fight as well as I could then. He's not talking about getting on airplanes. Verse 12, he says, so give me that hill country that the Lord promised me. You'll remember that as scouts, we found the descendants of Anak were living there in great walled towns, but the Lord is with me. There it is. The Lord is with me. Age 85. Anything can be done because the Lord's with me. I will drive them out of the land just as the Lord said. No retirement for Caleb. He finished well. Finding Philippians 1:20. Listen to this. For I fully expect, Paul writes, and hope. I have expectations and I have hopes that I will never be ashamed, but I will continue to be bold for Christ, as I have been in the past, and I trust that my life will bring honor to Christ, whether I live or I die. For to me, living means living for Christ, and dying is even better. But if I live, I can do more fruitful work for Christ, so I really don't know which is better. I'm torn between two desires. I long to go and be with Christ, which would be better for me. 4 things he says I want in my aging years. I want to be bold. I want to trust him more. I want to honor him. I want to be fearless, and I want to be fruitful. That's the resurrection life. It's a beautiful picture of the resurrection life. From the place we are sitting and filming, about 100 yards to the south of here, lies a grave for Catherine Bruce. We'll show you a picture of that grave. There's nothing spectacular about it. It's pretty small and simple, like she was. She was small and simple. I knew her as a child, and I knew her in the last 20 years, and she was a kick in the pants, let me tell you. She stood about 4'10", and she was as feisty and ornery as anyone I've ever known. She liked to call me Shorty. And she liked to walk by my office, and it didn't matter if I was studying or on the phone or counseling. She would flip my lights off and say, "You're burning electricity," and walk on past. We would go at it. Oh, she was so much fun. She joked about everything. Everything was funny. Everything was a joke, except one thing. When we got her talking about her daughter, she had 2 daughters. When we got her talking, and again, this grave is fairly new. It's been 2 years since she went to be with Jesus. But when she talked about her daughters, specifically about her younger daughter, I believe it was, she got very serious. Every time I talked to her, probably 10 times, about this subject matter. You see, her younger daughter had died tragically in a car accident. I believe it was in her mid to late 20s. And so she died early, kind of like Christy behind me. Not that she's behind me. But she had died early. And so you can see why Catherine would get so somber. But actually you don't know why. She would get so somber because she wanted to get a point across. She would say these exact words: "I am so grateful that Jesus took her. Her husband was abusive. And the thought of her living in an abusive situation her entire life was not something I could even handle. And so, thanks to God that he took her. Her job was done here. And she was truly grateful and appreciative of what God had done." And that is a picture of someone who believes in the resurrection, who believes that the life that awaits us is so much better than this life. But, as Paul said, while I'm here, until that day when my job is done, this is the life I live, to be faithful and bold and fruitful for Jesus. And that's a good thing. Better thing? Be fully with Jesus. And that's what a resurrected life is about. And that's why resurrection is so important. And that's why Resurrection Sunday is the greatest day ever. It gives us boldness and confidence and hope and a future that no one can deny. Yes, the details of the resurrection are very important, and our destiny of resurrection is so important. But for now, what matters most is that you and I live resurrected lives to honor the resurrected one. Have a wonderful celebration today, the greatest day of the year. Maybe you can come join me on the day he comes back in a cemetery like this. It'll be awesome. Love you all. Thanks for doing the journey with us. God bless you today.